Hello, everyone. I hope I am audible. I welcome you all to our third session, Metamorphosis of the Past, Architectural Heritage and Communal Memory in South Asia. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Plus 921 Heritage Talks 2025, our third webinar, which has taken place every year religiously. I, Marvi Mazhar, architect based in Karachi, developed the project Plus 921 Heritage Talks as form of response to ongoing deterioration and decay in urban Karachi, where conversation around repair and maintenance is hugely missing. Pakistan Chowk Community Centre, PCC, is an organization which has worked very hard since 2016 to be an advocate towards built environment, safeguarding public spaces, and establishing a strong stance towards preservation. Pakistan Chowk Community Centre strives to provide a space for community engagement, advancement of arts, and to provide a space for community in larger sect of culture and democratic and literary discourse in Karachi, especially focusing on urban infrastructure and preservation discourse. Plus 921 Heritage Talks is a project conceived in 2023, where every year PCC hosts discussions and webinars dedicated to the politics of heritage and preservation in South Asia. We open our doors it's a very interesting process. We stalk everyone the whole year and we make an inventory and repository of people. And then by May, we start shortlisting and kind of developing a concept where we start initiating discussions through how does this practice sits with this discussion. And usually this discussion or this concept is a response to a current problem at that time. So in the last 5 years, Karachi has been significantly affected by deterioration of public spaces and heritage as per se. And heritage of not just the colonial past, but also structures and spaces of yesterday. So we also want to see that how does heritage listing kind of expand from the response of the community, and how does the community become like a part of the discussion of the policy. So we are constantly want to engage and see that how others' practices and knowledge making helps us understand how to move forward. Plus 921 Heritage Talk is an innovative South Asian perspective which unveils radical discussion through yearly student-led curated series on an online platform, bringing different practices together, like I said earlier. PCC works hard to bring academics, bloggers, independent researchers, artists, architects, urban planners, policymakers, anthropologists, journalists, and fiction writers to come together to think about development, infrastructure, and ecology. It's my absolute pleasure to open the third session, where the 2025 topic is post-colonial narratives in South Asia. Before any further ado, I now introduce PCC this year's team who's worked very hard to put this project together. My lead curators, Samil and Sana, who have worked really hard to getting in touch with you and keeping you updated through these extensive emails that they've sent with a very structured formula. Description and coordination, documentation, Shaheen Numan, who we lovingly known as Auntie Shaheen, who put a lot of work towards Heritage Walk Karachi, a project where students, researchers, and visitors come together and witness a very important advocacy-related discussion, which takes every Sunday in Karachi. She's our very own whistleblower from field. We cannot begin without acknowledging this year's dynamic team who worked extremely hard on various sections like research, creativity, social media, and communication strategy. Again, Samil, Sana were core of this, but then we have a very important team right next to it is Asad Zafar from grammar school, Ishal Hassan Khan from BNU, Faiz Siddiqui, again from grammar school, Siham Dadaboy from NCA, Asadullah Rajpur from Indus Valley, and Kissa from Indus Valley as well. Before I start the session, just quick SOPs for everyone who's tuned in, especially the audience. I request to keep your mic on mute. If you have any questions, please leave it in the chat box, or while at the end of the session, we'll open it up and you're most welcome to have a discussion, an observation, or a question. It's up to you. When speakers finish presenting, we will open the space, and then usually speakers share work between 15 to 20 minutes. Our moderator will give a signal when it's 12 to 15 minutes. And this session is recorded and will be uploaded on PCC's YouTube channel. Our last 2 years sessions are also online, which I know that a lot of students refer to it whenever they have to write a paper or when they want to understand something. So I have started less being indirectly in touch, but these sessions really open up a very different lens for students to look at and understand how city works. I now welcome moderator Ishal for today, who will open the session by introducing our speakers. And on behalf of PCC and my allies who I work and advocate with, I generously carve out time in different time zones. So all my speakers who have carved out this important time, I thank you and I really appreciate. We are a bunch of people and activists who come together and are eagerly waiting to listen to you. So here's to you, Ishal, and wish you luck.
Thank you, Marvi, for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone. My name is Ishal Khan, and I am the moderator for today's session. We really appreciate you being here. I will now introduce today's session, Metamorphosis of the Past, Architectural Heritage and Communal Memory in South Asia. And now I will read the session brief. In South Asia, historical architecture serves as a symbolic record of our communities and the ideologies that existed during those eras, offering insight into our cultural evolution. These structures are often not conserved properly or are subjected to restoration efforts that use inappropriate and damaging materials, ultimately compromising their historical and cultural identity. In other cases, they are demolished to make way for urbanization, such as Bangladesh's 400-year-old wall protecting the historic Lal Bagh Killa was torn down to build a VIP parking lot. This talk will also examine how the deterioration of these sites deepens the marginalization of communities to whom these buildings were symbolic. Heritage sites, such as Empress Market, a historic area in Karachi, Pakistan, that has evolved through successive communities over time, went through an abrupt redevelopmental dismantling of its communal essence that culminated in the demolishment of its surrounding bazaars under the guise of beautification. The operation not only eradicated official market heritage sites, but also led to the displacement of an estimated 200,000 individuals who lost their livelihoods. To exacerbate matters, authorities employed high pressure hoses to remove the graffiti from the clock tower, causing immediate intervention by heritage experts to halt the damage. Spaces historically designed to be communal, such as public parks, gardens, and markets, now have become increasingly restricted to access by low income communities. Public spaces that previously served as hubs for intellectual exchange, artistic expression, and multicultural community life are often rendered inaccessible or recontextualized in ways that diminish their original communal significance. The ambition to create concrete jungles has also accelerated class divisions that result in increased alienations within individuals, loss of cultural narratives, and communal histories and stories. This session will explore how traditional communal gatherings might be reimagined today, while disentangling them from capitalistic frameworks and commercial associations. Additionally, to what extent do communal structures influence contemporary political discourse on cultural heritage and its preservation? To delve into today's discussion, we are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers. We warmly welcome Aniruddh Sharan, Abuzar Madhu, Fatima Hussain, and Ali Samoo. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us. It is a pleasure to have you here. We're delighted to welcome our first speaker on the panel, Aniruddh Sharan, joining us today. He is an architect originally from India and is now practicing in New York. Aniruddh Sharan is an architect and design researcher based in New York and New Delhi. Originally from India, his work focuses on adaptive reuse across different mediums and scales. His research interest lies at the intersection of strategic planning, environmental analysis, and comparative historical research. His current research is around the theme of speculating the future of aging modernism and explores the idea of generating alternative value for the existing built environment to an alternative environment and economical lens. He has prior experiences of working professionally as an architect and design researcher in India and Belgium. He worked with Studio Lotus, Delhi, India, on projects ranging from museum library within a historical fort in Rajasthan, creating rooftop residential extensions in the urban context of Delhi, to reusing stone cottages for resource in the hills of Uttarakhand. Subsequently, he has also worked as a design researcher with 51 and 4E, Brussels, Belgium, where his work focused on strategic programming through public participatory design and comparative research for urban transformation projects in Italy. He completed his bachelor's in architecture from SP Delhi and master's in architecture design research from Yale University, where he was recently awarded the Beatrice Chin Peak Memorial Prize for Adaptive Reviews. He currently works as an architectural designer with Bay Blinder Bell Architects in New York. Aniruddh, thank you so much for being here today with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to share my screen and get started. Is it visible, everybody? Okay. Thank you so much for organizing this and having me over. As was mentioned, my name is Aniruddh, and I'm an architect and design researcher from New Delhi. Today, I like to share some of my work on my ongoing research and focus on the first part of the theme, the metamorphosis of the past. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah. Built as a global project in the wake of decolonization and post-war reconstruction, modernist buildings are aging today and face the unique challenge of neither qualifying as heritage nor living up to the contemporary aesthetics of progress. Today, these structures stand at a unique crossroads of either conservation, alteration, or demolition, an issue which is particularly relevant and urgent in South Asia today, and has a grave impact on not only the socio-cultural fabric of our inherited past, but also upon the forthcoming environmental and economic future. Modernism, especially in India, was not only a design movement, but also part of a much larger socio-political project. Given the plurality and diversity of the young nation, it was adopted as a language as it was perceived as being devoid of any local associations and thus distinct from the decisive problems of the past. Although it was meant to serve as a vehicle to bring about social modernity, in hindsight, modernism grew only to the extent of bringing about an aesthetic modernity. The users of these spaces often associate these state-built projects with their own experience of slow bureaucracy and corrupt administration. With the lack of maintenance and the growing gap between the intended use and the current use, these buildings are often viewed today to be outdated, inhabitable, and problematic. Thus, both sides of the argument, one focusing on architectural merits and the others highlighting the public memory associated with it, have failed to garner a much larger public support in India at a time when the nation is going through a phase of discovering its new social-political identity. Today, many of these buildings lie in a state of neglect and obsolescence. Their aesthetics of raw finishes, once intended to champion frugal innovation and convey an honest expression, has fallen out of fashion with the ordinary citizens and the ambition of today's politician, both of which are today caught up in the frenzy of smart city aesthetic of progress. The tale of Pragati Maidan's demolition in 2017 has been well chronicled and published over the recent years. It is often written with a tone of nostalgia and laments the loss of a cultural fabric. Another such building, which currently finds itself in a similar situation regarding its future, is the Akbar Bhavan or Akbar Hotel in Delhi. Constructed in 1969, it is a building which has lived many lives but is currently lying abandoned and faces the threats of demolition. A common impulse in the face of such a dilemma has often been to return to the past in order to look ahead. Conservation has often served as a medium for creating appreciation, and for a long time it has relied solely on the crutches of history to justify the legitimacy of the subject and made heritage the central argument for its defense. But the deeper we go into applying this conventional approach, especially towards modernism in India, the more number of challenges arises. Broadly, there are two systematic large challenges that stand in the way. The first is what gets to be recognized as heritage, and the other being how is the worth of existing space evaluated. Let's begin with the argument of recognizing these buildings as heritage. In a country as old as India, the definition of history itself stretches across a very long timeline. And in comparison to 15th century forts, modernist architecture, a movement which saw its heights from the 50s to 80s, seems to be too young to be restored the same title. This became most apparent when the Heritage Conservation Committee by the Archaeological Survey of India kept a touristic audience in mind and deemed that no building less than 60 years old can be regarded as heritage. Which brings us to the next issue. Even when it is getting recognized as heritage, whose heritage is being protected? The value of a worth of a building, when evaluated through the lens of heritage alone, is derived from the value of association, be it the prestige of the designer or the legacy of its occupants. In the case of Indian modernism, this becomes a tricky line of argument. Today, there has become a big divide amongst the creators of these buildings and the current custodians of these spaces, who often view modernism as a Western import instead of a homegrown movement. The architectural media celebrating figures like Corbusier and Louis Kahn as shaping Indian modernism has brought worldwide attention, but has done more harm than good on this front. Extending from this problem of association is another challenge unique to the Indian landscape, the political symbolicism of modernism. It was built largely by the first state to create a socialist society. These buildings are often seen as an extension of the previous government's ideology. However, today the government is formed by the opposing party who rose on the power of mandate of restoring nationalism and ushering in global progress. Thus, as a combination of political vendetta of erasing structures of the past and adopting an aesthetic of development, many modernist buildings are being demolished in the name of modernizing of the infrastructure. Stemming from this is another governing factor that has become the economic feasibility of working with the existing buildings. There's a common misconception that it is cheaper to build afresh than to deal with repairing the existing. And this is due to the systematic biases present within the real estate market. You see, the existing buildings are assessed based on risks involved and are seen as liabilities. Their worth is often determined by the land it sits on and the potential it has to build on top of it. Driven by market speculations, which try to extract more value from the finite land, it creates a cycle of constant demolition and construction. But this also has a grave environmental impact, a dimension which is often ignored while calculating the cost-benefit analysis. The environmental costs are seen as the externalities which skew the levers towards demolishing for free. Both of these forces can be best exemplified through the current case of Akbar Bhawan in New Delhi. It was inaugurated in 1972 as part of the Asia International Trade Fair and marked the 25th anniversary of India's independence. The building was designed by a local architect named Shivnath Prasad, who had a deep admiration for Corbusier's principles. This became evident in his proposal for the Akbar Hotel, which was formerly heavily inspired by the Unité de habitation in Marseille. It incorporated the iconic features, the pilotis, brise-soleil, the service floor visually expressed, the sculpture elements on the rooftop, and even the exposed staircase with the backdrop of a blank sheer wall. This visual resemblance has made many authors project this building as a symbol of Corbusier's global influence. However, if we look just beyond the facade, we hear the voices of multiple authors and many elements which highlight the local rootedness of the project. On this project, Prasad collaborated with the visionary structural engineer Mahinder Raj, who in many respects can be seen as a central spine to read the Indian modernism movement. The tapered beam system, which met the columns in a webbed pattern, the freestanding staircases, the ramps, these have become iconic features of the building over the years. But apart from the structural theatrics, another key feature is the interior design done by Dale Keller and Leila Tyabji. The decor featured a blend of Indian handicraft elements and craft works set against the background of clean modernist geometry. This juxtaposition has become a local trend and can be still observed in the design world today. These resolutions are where the ingenuity of the building steps away from the shadows of Corbusier and the formal language of Western modernism, but goes underappreciated by the local audiences. Apart from the multiple authors, the building itself has gone to have many different lives. After serving as a hotel for 14 years, it was sold to the Ministry of External Affairs to become offices for the next 25 years, and the name changed from Akbar Hotel to Akbar Bhavan. In 2011, the ministry decided to move away and lease the building as a temporary campus for the South Asian University. In 2023, even the university has declared to move out, throwing the future of the Akbar Bhavan into question yet again. Today, the students have moved out, the administration has turned their gaze away from the cracking concrete, and the buzz of excitement that once surrounded it has turned into silence. Thus, as this example shows, viewing these buildings through a lens of heritage or history alone isn't helping their case, as modernism falls in the lacuna of being too young for heritage but too old for contemporary imaginations. Thus, it is time to reevaluate these buildings through an alternative lens and read them through different narratives. As much as a building is a product of ideas and means, an anthropocentric approach in its own way, a building is also a collection of resources, materials, and energy. Instead of being recognized by their age or characterized just on their stylistic resemblance, what if they were read as matters of matter? Analyzing the building through an environmental lens can help provide an alternative reading of these spaces. For example, apart from the visible out experience, this methodology can help recognize the different materials that are embedded within it. Each of these materials would have generated immense emissions during their own production, and thus have contributed to embodied carbon associated with them already. By demolishing an existing building, one is letting go of all these embedded emissions and contributing to waste. Applying this lens to the Akbar Bhavan helps render a different reading of the space. For example, despite its monolithic appearance, 35% of the building is actually made up of materials other than concrete, such as bricks, single-pane glass, metals, and wood paneling. These materials account for nearly 60% of the total embodied carbon stored within it. If the building is demolished, there would arise a need to build again, an act which is likely to result in a generation of more emissions through the phases of material extraction and building itself. The very act of demolishing these current buildings is also likely to result in the generation of additional emissions, pollution, and more critically, an immense amount of material waste. Given the non-biodegradable nature of materials in the modernist buildings, such as concrete, this becomes heaps of debris occupying landfills in a time when both land and material themselves is becoming a scarce resource. Given the scale of the Akbar Bhavan building, demolishing it would not only result in the erasure of a critical part of Delhi's socio-cultural history, but it is also likely to result in 18,000 cubic meters of construction waste and nearly 750,000 carbon emissions, further adding to the climate catastrophe. Comparing the scenarios of demolishing and building afresh versus making selective changes to support adaptive reuse can reveal and help reduce nearly 73% in carbon emissions. These analyses can help render new value and appreciation for the existing spaces. Given the current state of the climate crisis and the built environment's massive footprint and aggregating it, the urgency to reduce carbon emissions through minimizing new construction can become a driving force, justifying the retention and repair of existing buildings. In a time when audiences taking these critical decisions have differentiating priorities, instead of relying on subjective criteria like tastes, this methodology of adopting an environmental perspective allows one to form an alternative, universal metric which can justify the need for preservation and scientifically measure the impact of doing so. Using this logic, what if there was an argument for preservation but beyond heritage? What if there was an alternate approach towards the conservation policy? The first amendment is to determine the classification not on the basis of age, but through an intertemporal life cycle assessment. The environmental impact assessment needs to be conducted for both the current condition of the building and its future alternative. If the total embodied emissions surpass a certain threshold, the building, regardless of its age or use, needs to be prevented from demolition. The other metric which can help find more value in existing can be altering the way these buildings are assessed. Given the modernism was a movement that involved more than concrete itself, one needs to analyze the spatial qualities that it holds within. Much like the conditions assessment preservation reports, an alternative analysis of the ability to change and adapt needs to be recorded as a changeability index to highlight the hidden potential of these spaces. Additionally, a system of demolition permits needs to be established. Similar to the way a building permit is established, this process will create a need to justify the reason for social and environmental impact of demolition and demonstrate a management plan for the resulting debris. These various systematic shifts can help create an alternative landscape for preservation of the existing built environment, but beyond the existing rhetorics of age alone. Besides the convention constraints of conservation policies, the other major hurdle which modernist buildings are facing today are the economic realities of evaluating their worth and the cost of intervention. One alternative system can be assessing all buildings, both new and old, on the basis of their carbon emissions. Made up of embodied carbon and operational carbon, this can be the new basis for calculating something like a property tax. By understanding that reusing existing buildings can help avoid embodied carbon, and by repurposing, one can not only reduce the emissions involved, but also have a reduced tax, creating an economic incentive for adaptive reuse. Additionally, regulations such as applying higher charges on discarding debris or using new land for construction and providing tax breaks for reusing old materials can strengthen the economic argument. Today, most of our surrounding existing environment is starting to age, and with the pressures of limited natural resources and the climate crisis, disposing them away to neglect and erasure is no longer a viable option, as we can no longer environmentally afford. How to deal with the legacy of such buildings invites a deeper broadening and of conversations around conservations, and reinforces the need to adopt a multifocal lens which considers the environmental impact as much as the social cultural significance. What was once built as a new to raise the past has today become old itself, and raises the same question it had once aimed to be the answer of. How do you deal with an aging built environment? The answer going forth, however, it needs to be different. Thank you so much.
Oof, Aniruddh, this was beautiful. It was such a close to my heart topic, and I totally understand the control, alter, delete. I have so many questions for you. We got to talk more on this. Thank you again.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Aniruddh, on your informative research on Akbar Baban and the insights regarding the erasure of buildings to create more and their impacts. If anyone has any questions for Aniruddh, please drop them in the chat and we will address them during the question and answer session. Now I would like to introduce Abuzar Madhu. Abuzar Madhu is a Lahore-based performing artist, teacher, climate justice activist, and researcher whose work bridges art and activism. They hold an MPhil in cultural studies from the National College of Arts, rooted in decolonial methods, local wisdom, and indigenous knowledge systems. Their practice foregrounds the intertwined spheres of rivers, languages, and communities. As a founding member of the Ravi Bachao Tehreek, Save Ravi movement, Abuzar has organized monthly sangats, gatherings by the river, and initiated Ravi Yatra, an annual cross-border walk in the name of the river that builds solidarities across geographies. They believe in the power of cross-cultural and cross-border initiatives to heal shared ecological and historical wounds. In Lahore Biennale, Chapter 03, they're presenting Humming with Ravi, mapping colonial infrastructures, polluted drains, and communal rituals of resistance, often performing in costumes fashioned from river trash. Abuzar's engagement with moving images. Storytelling includes producing and collaborating on several ecological films, such as The Mother, The Sons, and The Holy River, 2024, Republic of Wailing Trees, 2023, and the British Council-supported documentary, Milap, 2023. Through performance, walking, and cinema, they invite audiences to remember, mourn, and reimagine relationships with land and water. Welcome to the conference, Abuzar. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Over to you.
ਮਿਹਰਬਾਨੀ ਜੀ ਮਾਰਵੀ ਤੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਚੌਕ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟੀਮ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ माजरत मैं अंग्रेज़ी च कोई इन्ना फ्लुएंट नहीं हाँ मैं अपनी जो प्रेजेंटेशन है वो उर्दू और पंजाबी जो भी आ रहा होगा उसमें मैं आपसे शेयर करूँगा सो कबूल कीजिए जो भी होगा तो और मैं बहुत बुरा हूँ टेक्नोलॉजी के साथ भी तो मैं स्क्रीन शेयर कर रहा हूँ अपनी मुझे 1-2 मिनट चाहिए हम्म,
Abuzar, I always say कि language is the first step towards the sense of protest. So आप अपनी ज़बान में बात करें, आपको जो जैसे करना है, काम बहुत
जी
इम्पोर्टेंट है।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया मानवी मेरी मेरी आ गई स्क्रीन
बिल्कुल।
सामने
इसको बस फुल कर दें प्लीज नीचे से।
जी जरूर सो बहुत शुक्रिया बात शुरू करने से पहले हमारे पंजाब की धरती के शायर हैं और फिलोसफर भी हैं अक्रॉस बॉर्डर और पूरी दुनिया में उनकी फिलॉसफी जो है वो एक मज़हब की शक्ल इख्तियार किए हुए है गुरु नानक उनका एक शब्द है उनकी एक शायरी है जिससे हम शुरू करेंगे अपनी बात वो कहते हैं पवन गुरु पानी पिता माता धरत महत दिवस रात दोए दाई दाया खेले सगल जगत के हवा हमारी गुरु है हमारी उस्ताद है पानी हमारा बाप है और धरती हमारी माँ है जमीन जो दिन और रात हैं वो दोनों दाई और दाया हैं और कुल जो जहान है वो इनकी गोद में जो है वो खेल रहा है सो किस तरह से ये जो शब्द है ये हमारा रिश्ता पानी के साथ धरती के साथ और अपने आप के साथ बिल्कुल एक नई तरह से जोड़ता है और जो इवन हवा को उस्ताद कहना ये कितनी एक इंटरेस्टिंग और मुख्तलिफ तरह की बात है इसी से इंस्पिरेशन लेके आज की जो बातचीत है वो मैं आपसे शेयर करूंगा मेरी जो बात है वो ज़्यादा दरिया के हवाले से ही है दरियाए रावी के हवाले से सामने आपके मैप है इसमें आप देख सकते हैं कि रावी जो है ये जो 5 दरिया हैं पंजाब के जो सखियां हैं इंडस की सिंधु की इनमें एक छोटा दरिया है जो हिमाचल प्रदेश से शुरू होता है कौन कौन से ग्लेशियर और छोटी छोटी वाटर बॉडीज मिलके इसको बना रहे हैं और फिर ये इंडिया से बहता हुआ पंजाब में और आता है और फिर लाहौर के पास से गुजरता है फिर लाहौर के पास से गुजर के ये चनाब में शामिल होता है चनाब के साथ मिलके ये सिंधु में जाता है और सिंधु के साथ जो है वो समंदर के साथ मिलने के लिए रवाना हो जाता है सो किस तरह से जो हमारे दरिया हैं हमारे दरिया के साथ जो स्पेसिस हैं वो किस तरह से हमारा वर्षा है मेरी बातचीत जो है वो कुदरत का बनाया हुआ जो आर्किटेक्ट है उसके साथ जुड़ी हुई है कि हवा धरती दरिया दरिया की सिर्फ अगर हम एक घाट की बात करें सो उसके साथ किस तरह से कितने हजार सालों की तारीख है किस तरह से वो हमारा वर्षा है और क्या कुछ अब उसके साथ हो रहा है सो रावी की कहानी छोटी सी 2 मिनट में मैं आपके साथ शेयर करता हूँ कि 1960 में एक इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी जो आजकल बहुत खबरों में है वो मुआहिदा होता है बहुत सारी दुनिया में दरिया हैं जो ट्रांस बाउंड्री रिवर हैं लेकिन ये इतना अजीबोगरीब मुआहिदा होता है कि इसमें 3 दरिया जो हैं वो उनका पानी जो है वो बेच दिया जाता है और उसके बदले में रकम लेके और बहुत बड़े जो मेगा डैम्स हैं जो है वो पाकिस्तान में वो बिल्ड किए जाते हैं, जिसमें वर्ल्ड बैंक भी मदद करता है, उस में ये तय होता है कि जी अब रावी का पानी जो है वो पाकिस्तान नहीं जाएगा। सो अब रावी की ज़मीन, रावी का आर्किटेक्ट, रावी ने जो ज़मीन के साथ मिलके बनाया है ताल्लुक के साथ, वो सब कुछ वहीं पे है। उसकी जो कम्युनिटीज़ हैं, मल्लाह हैं, किसान हैं, मज़दूर हैं, जुलाहे हैं, इतनी तरह की कम्युनिटीज़ हैं जो रावी के साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं, वो सब वहाँ पे मौजूद हैं। लेकिन ये एक फ़ैसला होता है कि अब रावी का पानी नहीं आएगा। तो उसके बाद अ, ये इस वजह से भी ज़रूरी है कि जो लाहौर है वो रावी के किनारे पर आबाद है। जिस तरह से कुछ लाहौर के अलावा अगर हम पीछे जाएं तो हम देखते हैं कि हड़प्पा जो इंडस वैली सिविलाइजेशन या हड़प्पन जो सिविलाइजेशन है, हड़प्पा का जो शहर है वो भी रावी के किनारे पर है। तो हम यहाँ से देख सकते हैं कि किस तरह से दरिया जो है वो हजारों साल की जो सिविलाइजेशन है, तहजीब है, इंसानों का बनना है, उसमें मदद जो है वो कर रहा है, और वो बेसिक सोर्स है। सो ये एक रावी की तस्वीर है जब रावी लाहौर में एंटर होने लगता है। कुछ 2 किलोमीटर पहले की इसकी तस्वीर है। यहाँ पे हम फिर थोड़ा सा देख सकते हैं कि किस तरह से रावी इंटरेक्ट कर रहा है ज़मीन के साथ। और वैसे तो मुझे जो एरियल व्यूज़ हैं वो कोई इंटरेस्टिंग नहीं लगते, थोड़े मुझे लगता है कि बहुत ऊपर से देखना वो एक हमारा रिश्ता बिल्कुल और तरह से बदलता है। लेकिन इस दरिया के आर्किटेक्चर को समझने के लिए कि किस तरह से ज़मीन का और किसानों का और आबादियों का इंटरेक्शन है, और उसके इसके दरमियान में आप ये जो काला जहर मादा देख रहे हैं, ये बड़ी बड़ी जो है वो सीवरेज की लाइंस हैं जो सीधे जाके रावी में गिरती हैं। सो अब लाहौर रावी के किनारे पे है, लेकिन लाहौर की मेमोरी में रावी नहीं है। सो ये कैसे हुआ? किस तरह से जो हमारा अब लाहौर पे हम माल रोड की बात करते हैं, माल रोड की बिल्डिंग्स की बात करते हैं, अब तो कई तरह से और आर्किटेक्चर के हवाले से भी कितनी तरह की डिस्कशन है जो लाहौर में हो रही है। लेकिन इस सब में जब हम हेरिटेज की बात करते हैं तो रावी का कहीं जिक्र नहीं है। रावी की कोई बात नहीं करता। तो किस तरह से एक बॉडी जो जो ये पूरा शहर कंस्ट्रक्ट कर रही है, वो किस तरह से जो है वो शामिल नहीं है, इस पूरी डिबेट में ही शामिल नहीं है। चाहे वो आर्किटेक्चर की डिबेट हो, चाहे वो हमारे इस जो वर्षा है उसकी, हेरिटेज की जो है वो बात हो। सो रावी इस वक्त दुनिया का जहरीला तरीन दरिया है। पानी ना आने की वजह से लाहौर का जितना वेस्ट है वो डायरेक्ट रावी में जो है वो फेंक रहे हैं। 3 इंडस्ट्रियल एरियाज हैं जिनका वेस्ट रावी में आ रहा है। ये जो आप तस्वीर देख रहे हैं इसमें भी कुछ जो है वो एक इंडस्ट्री का नाला है जो आ रहा है, और बाकी एक आबादी का है। सो और आप शहर को भी देख रहे हैं कि वो किस तरह से दरिया की तरफ जो है वो बढ़ रहा है। सो अब हम ये बात करेंगे, ये इस पतन का नाम है पतन। दरिया की वो जगह होती है जहां से दरिया को क्रॉस किया जाता था पहले, उसको जो पंजाबी चेसी पतन कहते हैं। सो यह लाहौर दा मेन पतन है। इसके ऊपर मेन रावी ब्रिज बना हुआ है जहां से क्रॉस करके शदरा जाया जाता है, और अपने मोटरवे के नए पुल भी बन गए हैं और काफ़ी ज़्यादा। लेकिन ये मेन पुल है जो रावी को क्रॉस करने के लिए इस्तेमाल होता है। उसके नीचे ये एक पत्तन था पुराना जिसका नाम है राजगढ़ पत्तन। अब राजगढ़ पत्तन, ये मुझे एक बल्लाह ने जो है उन्होंने मुझे बताया। अब राजगढ़ पत्तन पे कई घाट थे, जिसमें से एक तो अभी भी घाट के नाम से ही जो है वो मशहूर है, जो राजगढ़ पत्तन से थोड़ा सा आगे है। अब रावी दरिया के साथ जो है वो कई अगर हम देखें हजारों साल की जो हमारी तारीख है वो किस तरह से जुड़ी हुई है, हमारी जो कम्युनल मेमोरी है उसमें रावी किस तरह से मौजूद है। कि अगर हम अपनी बात करें ऋग्वेदा से शुरू करें तो हमें रावी जो है वो इरावती सबसे पहले जो है वो परुष्णी के नाम से हमें रावी का जिक्र मिलता है, और रावी परुष्णी के बाद फिर इरावती आता है उपनिषद में, और फिर रावी के बाद इरावती के बाद फिर रावा, और फिर महमूद गजनवी के वक्त में जो है वो रावी के नाम से जो है ये वाटर बॉडी जानी जाती है। लेकिन इसके साथ ये सिर्फ अगर हम राजगढ़ पत्तन की बात करें, इसी एक पत्तन की बात करें, तो किस तरह से ये हमें हमारी जो पूरी हजारों साल की हिस्ट्री है उसके साथ जोड़ती है। क्योंकि रावी जो एक मशहूर लड़ाई है, हमारे दोस्त सरहद पार से भी मौजूद हैं, पांडवों की जो लड़ाई, उसका भी जो मैदान है वो रावी के करीब है। और इसके अलावा रावी के साथ पूरी एक राम और सीता की कहानी मौजूद है। रावी के ऊपर एक जगह है जिसका नाम है राम चौंतरा। चौंतरा कोई ऊंची जगह या बैठने की जगह होती है, तो कहा जाता है कि वहाँ रावी के बहुत बल हैं, रावी दरिया। और किस तरह से लोगों के साथ भी ये बात जुड़ी हुई है कि जिन्ने वल रावी दे ने एने ही वल एदे रहन आले विच ने, कि जितने बल रावी में इतने इसके रहने वालों में। तो किस तरह से दरिया के साथ ही लोगों की शनाख्त भी जो है वो जुड़ी हुई है, शहर की शनाख्त जुड़ी हुई है, तहजीब की शनाख्त जुड़ी हुई है। सो एक जगह जाके वहां पे कुछ किलोमीटर का जो एरिया है वहां पे रावी बिल्कुल सीधी जो है वो नदी की शक्ल में बहती है। तो वहां पे राम चौंतरा और उस पूरे इलाके के साथ राम और सीता की कहानी मशहूर है कि राम यहाँ पे जो है वो स्नान किया करते थे, और क्योंकि उनके कपड़े किनारे पे रखे होते थे तो फिर उन कपड़ों पे निगाह रखने के लिए वहां से पूरा दरिया जो है वो सीधा हो गया। कि किस तरह से हमारी मिथ्स जो हैं वो दरिया का जो बनना है, दरिया का जो हेरिटेज है, दरिया की जो कंस्ट्रक्शन है, उसको समझा रही है ये कहानी कि दरिया सीधा क्यों। उसके बारे में भी हमारे पास पूरी एक कहानी जो है ये वो मौजूद है। इसके अलावा लाहौर में दाता की नगरी, दाता का दरबार बहुत मशहूर, उसकी बहुत सारी कहानियां जो हैं वो रावी के साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं। कि किस तरह से रावी जो है वो लाहौर के बिल्कुल रावी दरिया की मेन बॉडी नहीं, लेकिन रावी दरिया का एक लड़ है, होता है कि जिस तरह दरिया का पूरा एक निज़ाम है, उसका एक एक जो शाख है वो किले के करीब से भी बहती थी, और वही दाता दरबार के करीब से भी आती थी। कहते हैं कि एक बार सैलाब आया और पानी उस दरबार के अंदर जाने लगा, तो दाता ने हुक्म दिया दरिया को कि तुम दूर चले जाओ। सो वहां से इस वजह से दरिया जो है वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता लाहौर शहर से दूर होना शुरू हुआ। तो किस तरह से ये बात भी हमें दरिया के दर्शन करवाती है, और दरिया के हवाले से एक और तरह से सिखाती है कि दरिया और शहर, दरिया और लोग किस तरह से उनका इंटरेक्शन क्या है, कि वो दरिया के साथ बात भी कर रहे हैं। दरिया एक लिविंग एंटिटी है। दरिया एक जो है वो हमारी तो पूरी सिंधु तक ये रीत है कि एक जीवन हस्ती के तौर पर, एक लिविंग एंटिटी के तौर पर, ख्वाजा खिजर के तौर पर इसको जो है वो देखा जाता है। इसी तरह से माधु लाल हुसैन लाहौर के एक फ़कीर हैं, जिनके शाह हुसैन और माधु, उनकी कहानी भी रावी के साथ जुड़ी हुई है। कि किस तरह से एक एक दरवाज़ा है लाहौर का जिसका नाम अब शेरा वाला गेट है, लेकिन वो पहले खिजरी गेट था। खिजर अलैहिस्सलाम जो हैं वो एक बुजुर्ग, वो भी रावी के साथ और हर वाटर बॉडी के साथ जुड़े हुए हैं। सिंध में उनके नाम की दरगाह भी है, और ये जहाँ जहाँ पानी है वहाँ खिजर है। सो ये पूरी एक जो तारीख है और लोगों की बात है वो जुड़ी हुई है इसके साथ। सो उनकी पूरी कहानी है जो रावी के साथ, के माधु पार है और शाह हुसैन इस पार है, वो किस तरह से मिल रहे हैं, रावी उनमें क्या रोल अदा कर रहा है, माधो लाल की हुसैन की पोइट्री में रावी किस तरह से आ रहा है। सो फिर उसके बाद गुरुओं का सिलसिला सारा, गुरु नानक का पानी के साथ किस तरह से ताल्लुक है, पूरा सिख रिलीजन किस तरह से जुड़ा हुआ है, और रावी में पांचवें गुरु जो हैं गुरु अर्जन, वो किस तरह से डिसअपेयर होते हैं मुगलों के जुल्म के बाद, और रेजिस्टेंस की सारी कहानी किस तरह से फिर रावी के साथ जुड़ी हुई है। फिर अहमद खान खरल हैं जो अंग्रेज़ों से लड़ रहे हैं, उसको रावी का राशक कहते हैं, रावी का लड़ाका कहते हैं। सो वो किस तरह से सो ये सारी बात जो हम कर रहे हैं कि किस तरह से जो दरिया का जो हेरिटेज है, दरिया का जो आर्किटेक्ट है, वो किस तरह से लोगों से कम्युनिकेट कर रहा है, लोग उसके साथ किस तरह से कम्युनिकेट कर रहे हैं। अब पूरे जो ब्यूरोक्रेसी का जो प्लान है जो हेरिटेज की बात कर रहा है, उसमें दरिया की बात कहीं भी नहीं है। लेकिन दरिया पे भी मेला लग रहा है। ये जो तस्वीर है ये लाहौर पे लाहौर के रावी के किनारे लगने वाले एक मेले की है। इसकी एक और तस्वीर मैं आपको दिखाता हूँ। ये एक छोटी सी कश्ती है जो उन्होंने ख्वाजा खिजर के नाम की बनाई हुई है, जिसमें मन्नत की मेहंदी भी है, तेल भी है, और ये अब्दुल कादिर जैलानी के नाम की भी कश्ती है। और ये एक मेला एक माई ने शुरू किया था, माई बेड़ियां वाली, तो उसके नाम की ये रीत चल रही है। अगर हम इसे देखें तो ये बहुत ज़्यादा मैं कुछ दिन पहले श्रीलंका में था, तो श्रीलंका में मैंने एक छोटा सा एक देवी का प्रोसेशन वहां पे देखा, जो एंड हो रहा था वाटर बॉडी के पास, कि वो उसको वाटर बॉडी के हवाले कर रहे थे। जो कुछ दिन पहले मैंने लाहौर में देखा कि अशूरा का ताल्लुक किस तरह से रावी के साथ है, कि जितने भी ताजिए बन रहे हैं वो किस तरह से जा रहे हैं। सो ये रावी लोगों की जबान में, लोगों की मेमोरी में रावी कैसे कम्युनिकेट कर रहा है, लेकिन फिर जो कॉलोनियल लैंग्वेज है वो दरिया को कैसे देख रही है, वो किस तरह से इसके ऊपर पूरे थीसिस जो हैं हमें मिलते हैं, पूरा नैरेटिव मिलता है कि दरिया डैमिंग किस तरह से होती है, कैनाल कोलोनाइजेशन किस तरह से होती है, और उसके साथ कैसे रिश्ता हमारा सारा दरियाओं के साथ बदलता है, इस नेचुरल हेरिटेज के साथ किस तरह से फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता पंजाब में खासतौर पर और सिंध तक ये जाता है कि रिश्ता चेंज होना शुरू होता है। और पानी जो इतनी बड़ी हमारी माइथोलॉजी और जीवन का हिस्सा है, वो किस तरह से में सिर्फ एक जो है वो एक कमोडिटी के तौर पर उसको देखना शुरू हो जाते हैं। फिर उसको आर्किटेक्ट भी किस तरह से कमोडिटी के तौर पर देखता है, और फिर स्पेशली आज का जो रियल स्टेट है वो किस तरह से देख रहा है, क्योंकि वो लेगेसी, जो कॉलोनियल लेगेसी है, वो किस तरह से अब मॉडर्न जो कह लें उसके साथ इंटरेक्ट कर रही है, डिस्कोर्सेस के साथ। सो इस वक्त रावी में पानी नहीं है, रावी जहरीला तरीन दरिया है। लेकिन कुछ साल पहले एक नारा लगता है और उसमें कहा जाता है कि हम, ये एक उसी मेले की तस्वीर है जिसमें पेश किया जा रहा है दरिया को, ये भी उसी मेले की तस्वीर है। सो ये एक है कि ये एक मशीन है जो दरिया में से रेत निकालने के लिए इस्तेमाल होती है, और इस पर पाबंदी है। मैंने दरिया में ट्रैवल किया, जहाँ से दरिया शुरू पाकिस्तान में एंटर होता है, यहाँ से लेके और चनाब के मिलने तक, तो पता नहीं 50 के करीब इस तरह की मशीनें जो इलीगल हैं, जो नहीं लग सकती, वो दरिया में मौजूद हैं। और वो दरिया में से जो जो पाइप आप देख रहे हैं, ये रेत निकाल रहे हैं, ये ज़मीन के अंदर बोर करके जो है वो रेत पहुंचा रहे हैं। यहाँ पे जितनी भी इस वक्त एक्सप्लॉयटेशन है, कि जो जितनी कंस्ट्रक्शन हो रही है शहर में, उसका साथ रेत जो है वो रावी से जा रहा है। तो रावी इस वक्त रेत का एक सोर्स है, और इसके अलावा सारा डम इसमें हो रहा है, जो जितना भी वेस्ट है। और इसके अलावा अब एक नया नारा लगता है कि हम रावी के पानी को साफ करेंगे। वो कैसे करेंगे कि हम रावी के किनारे पे 42 किलोमीटर पे 1,10,000 एकड़ ज़रूरी रकबे पर हम एक जो है वो बड़ा शहर, नया शहर बसाएंगे। सो उसमें रावी जो है उसको हम इसको साफ कर देंगे, और ये जो रावी नदी है ये एक रिवर फ्रंट एक वाटर बॉडी का रोल अदा करेगी। सो किस तरह से पूरी लैंग्वेज हमारी दरिया के बारे में चेंज हो रही है, कि दरिया सिर्फ अब एक इसको हम सोच रहे हैं कि अगर हम यहाँ पे सोसाइटी बनाएंगे तो किस तरह से एक सिर्फ ये हमें हमारा फ्रंट बनेगा। दरिया का जो पूरे कल्चर और उसके साथ रिश्ता है वो कैसे टूट रहा है। और यहाँ पर अब एकेडमिया हमारा किस तरह से हमारी जबान ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਦਰਿਆ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦਰਿਆ ਦੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਦਰਿਆ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਇਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਲਿਵਿੰਗ ਆਰਕੀਟੈਕਚਰ ਹੈ, ਇਹਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣ ਲਈ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ, ਕਿਵੇਂ ਇਲਮ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ ਉਤੋਂ ਦੀ ਬਜਾਏ ਥੱਲੋਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ, ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਲਾਵਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੀਏ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝੀਏ। ਸਾਡੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਂ ਕੱਲ ਹੀ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਦੀ ਇੱਕ ਗਲੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਿਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਸਾਂ, ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਇੱਕ ਸੀ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ ਮਾਈ बेरी वाली। मुझे बहुत तजस्सुस हुआ कि ये माई बेरी वाली की क्या दरगाह है। तो मैं अंदर गया तो वो सिर्फ बेरी का एक दरख्त है जो जिसको उन्होंने कवर किया हुआ है, और वहां पे एक पानी का एक घड़ा रखा हुआ है। उस तरह से वो दरख्त जो है वो उस पूरे शहर का हिस्सा है, वो गली का एक हिस्सा है, लेकिन वो दरख्त से ज्यादा उसकी मतलब वो दरख्त भी है, लेकिन वो एक पीर भी है, वो एक माई भी है जो जिਉਂਦੀ है। लोग वहां पे आके मन्नतें भी मांग रहे हैं। सो ये पूरी किस तरह से जो छोटे छोटे कुएं हैं जो अभी तक लाहौर शहर में के अंदर मौजूद हैं, वाटर डिफरेंट तरह की वाटर बॉडीज हैं, डिफरेंट तरह के, सो वो किस तरह से पूरी एक उनके साथ जो कम्युनल जो भी हिस्ट्री और बात वो किस तरह से जुड़ी हुई है, और फिर अब उसके साथ वो किस तरह से अब आहिस्ता आहिस्ता उसको इरेज कैसे हो रही है, आहिस्ता आहिस्ता वो लोगों की मेमोरी में से किस तरह से निकल रही है। और फिर जो मॉडर्न जितने भी न्यू लिबरल ये डेवलपमेंटल प्रोजेक्ट हैं, ये किस तरह से दरिया को और इस जो लिविंग आर्किटेक्चर उसको किस तरह से देख रहे हैं। सो ये कुछ सवाल थे और कुछ दरिया के हवाले से बात थी जो आपके साथ शेयर की। मैं अपनी बात ख़त्म कर रहा हूँ क्योंकि कुछ टाइम मैंने नहीं देखा और वो मेरे ख़त्म हो गया। बस ये एक फिर हम कुछ एनुअल प्रोटेस्ट करते हैं उस पूरे रूडा है बेसिकली जो इस पूरे इस जो मेगा डेवलपमेंट प्रोजेक्ट है उसको देख रहा है, राबी अर्बन डेवलपमेंट प्रोजेक्ट को, जिसमें सैकड़ों गांव हैं जो डिस्प्लेस होंगे, और ये बहुत बड़ा दरिया के साथ जो है इस जो हमारा हेरिटेज है उसके साथ जुल्म हो रहा है। सो ये उस एनुअल जो हमारा प्रोटेस्ट है उसकी एक तस्वीर है। सो अब रूडा वाले भी हमारे इस प्रोटेस्ट में इस साल आए थे और उन्होंने आके किया था। ये हमने एक और एक्टिविटी की थी इसी दरिया की मेमोरी को वापस शहर का हिस्सा कैसे बने, और पंजाब की ख़ास तौर पर पंजाब का ये मसला है क्योंकि वो अपनी ज़ुबान के साथ भी उस तरह से जुड़े नहीं, और वो सारा, और इसमें बहुत सारी बातें हम बहुत सिंपली बहुत ओवर सिंप्लीफाई कर रहे हैं, लेकिन फिल वक्त टाइम भी नहीं है। सो ये माधुलाल हुसैन की इस वक्त मौजूदा दरगाह है। अब हमारे दोस्त हैं वो सरहद पार से जो पंजाब के बाकी जो दरिया पाकिस्तान में नहीं आते उनका पानी लेके आए, ब्यास का, और सतलुज भी बहुत कम मिकदार में आता है उसका, और हमने लाहौर पंजाब में जो यहाँ पे दरिया आ रहे हैं चिनाब और झेलम उनका पानी इकट्ठा किया हम, और उन पानियों को फिर मादुलाल लेके गए। उन पानियों को लेके हमने शहर की गलियों में हमने मूव किया, साथ में पानी की बात की, और वो पानी के साथ इस रिश्ते की बात की। सो ये मादुलाल की दरगाह, और किस तरह से मादुलाल की दरगाह पे अभी भी रावी की बात है और अब ये रावी से बहुत दूर है। सो ये एक छोटी सी परफॉर्मेंस की जिसमें दरिया से ही गंद उठा के तो एक कॉस्ट्यूम डिज़ाइन किया। ये बस एक मैं अपना पर्सनल जो कुछ रेजिस्टेंस का और वो सफ़र है वो आपसे शेयर कर रहा हूँ, कि किस तरह से हम ओवरऑल इन अपनी वाटर बॉडीज़ को, इन कुदरत के जो आर्किटेक्चर है इसके बारे में हम कैसे बात करें, कैसे जो ये लोगों लोगों जो जो हमारा फोक और इंडिजिनस नैरेटिव है, और ख़ास तौर पर जानने का जो इल्म का जो सोर्स है उसको भी अब जो रास्ते हैं जो वेज हैं जानने के, उनको भी हमें कैसे ज़रूरत है कि हम समझें कि हमारे पास कौन से मौजूद हैं रास्ते जानने के, समझने के, महसूस करने के, और उसके अपनी कहानियाँ बताने के। सो चाहे वो शहर की कहानियाँ हों, हेरिटेज की कहानियाँ हों, बिल्डिंग्स की कहानियाँ हों, तो हमारे पास कौन से हमारे तरीके क्या हैं जानने और समझने के, उसके बारे में मेरा ख्याल सोचने की ज़रूरत है। बहुत शुक्रिया।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया माधु, थैंक यू सो मच। इसमें तो एक पूरी बात अलग से हो सकती है, जो तुम्हारी सारी डिस्कशंस, एंड आई नो कि ये एक सरफेस लेवल है, एंड हाउ मच यू टेक पोइट्री इनटू योर वर्क, हाउ मच लिटरेचर यू टेक इनटू योर वर्क, इट्स अ रिफ्लेक्शन। सो इसके ऊपर तो बहुत मज़ीद डेप्थ में बात करने की ज़रूरत है। इशाल, वुड यू प्लीज़ इनवाइट आवर थर्ड स्पीकर?
Thank you, Abuzar, for your enlightening insights on the histories and stories of Ravi and bringing awareness to the current deterioration of Ravi. If anyone has questions for Abuzar, please drop them in the chat and we will address them during the question and answer session. Next on the panel, we welcome Ali Samoo. Ali Samoo is currently an Erasmus Mundus Scholar in the Four Cities Consortium, researching the case of villages inside Bahria town, Karachi. Ali is interested in questions of vulnerability, agency, and spatial transformation in Karachi. Through this research, they are looking at how colonial and post-colonial administration shaped the process of land disposition and how communities resist against land capture. They have previously worked with Watsal, Karachi Urban Lab, Fateh Point Archives, and Intersect Hub at the University of Copenhagen. Ali Samu, thank you for being here with us today. We can't wait to hear what you have to share with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going
Just
to
before
share
you
my
start,
screen.
Ali, I would like
Yes.
everyone to mute themselves. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I'm just going to quickly bring up my little Canva presentation. Okay, hi. So Karachi, I'm just going to briefly introduce Karachi first to give context for some of my work. Karachi, for those of you who are not familiar, is a city that has kind of gone through immense socio-spatial and political changes throughout its history. It was and continues to be a fragmented city, a city of migrants. And it continues to also be an incredibly diverse and yet a highly unequal urban landscape. It was also a city with colonial and post-colonial legacies that intersect with military and corporate capital that play out in space in multiple ways. And then urbanization as a process, and urbanization is the question that I'm particularly interested in, as a process that shapes the city, speaks to the many inequalities that reproduce Karachi at an everyday scale. These inequalities obviously refer to the ways in which gender, race, ethnicity, caste, class, citizenship, disability, etc., map out the contours of the city and inform what goes on inside them. And because communities from various backgrounds inhabit the grounds of the city, relations to land and infrastructure kind of figure very prominently in the discourse around development that often hinges on this like violent process of eviction and erasure and displacements. And then speaking through heritage and infrastructure, obviously the city has vast amounts of old buildings and public spaces that need to be protected in its dense center. But what is often lost is that which lies in its periphery, not only in terms of material infrastructure, but also social and cultural infrastructures. So similar to what Abuzar said about the river as being something of a heritage site, I look at the peripheries of Karachi and the farms and the villages and the cultures as infrastructure, as heritage sites. So my research took me to Malir, the largest district of Karachi, to look closely at the kind of agrarian urban land transformations that are currently shaping the city's periphery, which is this large district in the pink. And particularly, I wanted to look at Bahria Town, which is one of Pakistan's largest gated real estate projects that sits along the main M9 highway. That's transforming not only the physical geography, but also the ecological, climatic, spiritual, and sociocultural relationships that people of Malir have had with their land. And all of this is happening through a kind of rapid infrastructural development that's taking place. And when Bahria came around 15, 17 years ago, of course, there are people like Shahana Rajani and Zara Mankani who have shown how entire ways of life were erased through their artistic practice. And I'm trying to continue their work in looking at villages. When Bahria Town came, what was erased was popularly kind of narrated in the urban imaginary of Karachi as Banjar Zameen and barren land upon which Bahria Town supposedly brought development in the sense of modernity to populate and urbanize the district. Farms and villages that existed prior were not considered as infrastructure or heritage sites sufficiently enough for the state or civil society to imagine them as worth saving or worthy of existing at all. So what becomes conflated in such a situation is then not only the physical material things, but also the domains of life making that come under the insufficiency of what infrastructure is. Local infrastructures of farming, tilling, community making, kinship hosting, all existed outside of the frameworks of what modern or capitalistic infrastructures should look like in the global urban sense. And this is the point at which I want to kind of ask that, are we willing to first understand the complex desires of capitalist reproduction of infrastructural relations in the post-colony that gives way to erasures of villages and farms like those in Malir? Or will we, as artists and academics and activists, continue to kind of limit the scope of what urban heritage and infrastructure is? And that is, I think, the point of this kind of webinar as well, to expand the scope of what heritage can mean for us. And so bringing within the folds of the urban, the historical farming and pasturing infrastructures, it needs to be brought into conversation, um, especially in the ways that it is being preserved or efforts are being made to preserve it through the local communities that live there. So my focus is particularly on villages that have remained inside Beria town. These are villages that are spread out within the gated compound and are themselves encircled by walls to produce a barrier between them and Beria town's roads. You can see here, for instance, this map. The yellow is all Beria town, and the little pink dots are where the villages are at. So Beria town largely occupies tens of thousands of acres of land, and the boundary wall of Beria town itself is 80 kilometers long, within which are some villages that have managed to stay. Of course, it is only the villages that have remained. Their farmland that once connected one village to another have all but disappeared over the last 15 years. And thousands of acres of farmland have been illegally taken over by Beria town to develop their housing scheme for real estate speculation. But nonetheless, my conversations with residents of the villages revealed much about what conservation of space and culture looks like in the face of occupation and erasure. Parts of my thesis work that I'm doing right now looks at the tactics that were used to save as much land as possible against land grabbing by Beria town as a way to understand acts of resistance as forms of reimagined heritage and cultural preservation, especially in the context of communal land. And another part of my work kind of looks at the everyday ways in which resistance shapes how villages manage to remain. And of course, this is something I borrow theoretically from Asif Bayat's work on the quiet encroachment of the ordinary and what he conceptualizes as the art of remaining present. And the very fact that these villages have remained inside Beria town is testament to their continued resistance against these developmental forces. And I want to show this here. One of the villages, Haji Ali Muhammad Gabul Goat, which I'm briefly saying HAMG. This is kind of the wall that separates Beria town and the village. And of course, like these are violent infrastructures that are supposed to keep villages inside their smaller domains and act as infrastructures of and kind of like act as both infrastructures of preservation for the villages themselves, because they also fought for these walls to be erected, but at the same time also for Beria town to maintain control, maintain spatial control over how the villages can manage to kind of exist. I want to show this here. I want to share kind of three acts of resistance of that kind of show how preservation takes place through community movements inside these villages. This is one village, HMG, and you can see the boundary wall all around it. It's kind of like a pear-shaped village, and the road network all are built all around it. It's an entire system of occupation. So HMG, they told me about the court cases that they fought that led to the creation of the wall that encircles them today to protect them from further violence and land occupation from Beria town. This wall allows them to live inside their village, although with no municipal provisions, because there is no way for the municipal provisions to pass through Beria town to get to the village. And of course, Beria town would much rather kind of have the village starve than give them a line for electricity. Nonetheless, when the legal proceedings were happening, one of the ways in which one of the things that was discussed in the ruling is that a particular distance was measured from the village core, which is here, and how much land will be granted to them, and where the wall will be kind of will settle. When the initial ruling came out, and the communities kind of heard about the walls coming, they started to notice that the inner core of the village is super tiny. And because the distance was measured from the farthest house for the land to be granted to them, they started impromptu building shack housing. So all around in these areas against the wall that you can see, some of these shacks are temporary shack housing that nobody lives in, but were built to stake a claim to space for the courts to grant them a little bit more land. So the house would traditionally be here, where you can see the yellow patch, but they tried to make a small shack here, so the wall can be extended a little bit more to here. Otherwise, the wall would have been much closer to the village, and they would have a much smaller piece of land to live in. This is kind of one way that we can learn from communities who actively engage, risk their lives to resist, to preserve their space, to kind of hold on to their land. Of course, these villages were also given many incentives. Of course, there was also coercion, violent coercion by military capitalist forces, but they were also given, and they continue to be given, many incentives to sell their land to Beria Town so that they can just have a uniform real estate thing. But relationships to land, to farming, to cultures, to their animals, to the trees are valuable enough for them to maintain their existence despite not having electricity, despite not having water, despite not having the social kinship networks that they would otherwise have had amongst other villages. So this was kind of one interesting way that I thought that we could look at how heritage can be conceptualized and how preservation can be conceptualized from the ground up. Another instance that I'd like to share, and I'll let this video kind of play in the background because I don't have pictures for that. This other instance was when I met a boy inside Beria Town herding goats. Although the very main gate of the gated compound explicitly states, and there's a sign present that warns of the many fines that one may be subjected to if one is found with livestock, because the entire purpose of this housing scheme is anti-farming, and they want to actively erase farming cultures. Nonetheless, he let the goats graze over the sidewalks of Beria Town, in a part of Beria Town where the compound had a low security perimeter. When I asked him that, where did you come from and how are you herding goats here? Isn't it illegal inside this compound? He stated that he kind of built a hole in the wall in order for a hole just big enough for the goats and himself and his sister to pass through. And when I told him why make the hole here specifically, he mentioned that the herd wants to go this way. This is where the animals have been grazing and pasturing for a very long time, and this is where our forefathers and fathers would take the goats and the herds to pasture, and so the goats have a natural path, and this wall obstructs this path. So we built a hole naturally. And despite, again, this is a form of risk. There's a heavy risk involved here, because authorities can come in anytime and take their goats away, put them, mark them with a heavy fine, potentially also potentially also like incarcerating them. There's also a carceral quality to this kind of landscape. But nonetheless, these risks are taken, and the goats are allowed to. There's a path made for the goats to graze. This is kind of another way of conceptualizing cultural heritage, practices of cultural heritage that continue to exist despite violent forms of erasure that kind of stake a claim to occupy these landscapes. At another quick instance that I want to kind of share is when I passed through another village, passed through another wall, a similar wall, a man had built a person from the village had built a small metal door against the wall that that kind of had a kind of camouflaging painting towards the outside of the gate to kind of make it seem as if it's a continuous wall. But the gate was open at that time. The small door was open at that time. Beyond the door, he had a small cabin to sell cigarettes and snacks, which he would, of course, close the moment security patrols passed through. He told me that when the boundary walls of the village were made, they were only allowed 1 or 2 entrances into and outside of the village. This meant that those living in the farthest kind of corners of the village did not have access to the vast road network that was paved by Town in all directions around the village. So something like this, there are 2 road networks here and here. These are unpaved roads, but people living below don't have access to the roads of Town here, for instance. And yet he broke the wall and he installed a gate. His customers are mainly construction workers who work on the same roads and infrastructures that close in on the village. Nonetheless, there is a negotiated presence of the small informal gate and the cabin space that exists within it, as another way in which occupation is kind of fought through an infrastructural kind of rearrangement. All of these instances also show infrastructural rearrangement to be appropriated and used for preservation, heritage, and resistance purposes. And of course, these are just 3 of the many, many instances where infrastructure, especially that of walls, was appropriated to negotiate a livelihood, in part to sustain their way of life, despite the very, very harsh conditions of occupation that they live under. And the village residents themselves state that this kind of occupation is akin to imprisonment. And politically, they also refer to themselves as more or less kind of equally in a plight as the Palestinians because of occupation. And they call the developer, they kind of like name the developer as Israel, that Town is like Israel, who has occupied our land, who has imprisoned us inside these walls, and who has imposed this kind of carceral systems. And I wanted to kind of show these instances to compel a rethinking of the ways in which we imagine heritage infrastructure, and to kind of ask for a tying of infrastructures to urban, political, historical, cultural, and embedded relationships that communities have had and continue to sustain. And of course, there are larger protests that happen.
Ali, I'm going to give you a heads up here with your time.
This is just my last thing. Of course, there are larger protests that happen, organized forms of resistance that happen, and that kind of fight these like urban privatization regimes, like these developmental schemes. But there are also these smaller, more everyday, infrastructurally kind of bound ways of resisting that kind of act against this reconfiguration of land relations that is actively shaping contemporary urbanization in Karachi. And so I think there is something to learn from these community practices, from these local practices of obstruction, of destruction of walls, of defying occupation in these ways, of risk that they put their bodies through. And I think this could be an interesting kind of look towards how we can reimagine and expand the scope of heritage management and heritage infrastructures. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ali. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much for taking and giving us all these instances, sharing with us those are very important to understand landscape from that perspective.
Yeah. Thank you for your research, Ali. It is interesting seeing farms and villages as heritage sites and the way these communities also resist the occupation. Now I would like to welcome Fatima Hussain. Fatima Hussain is an artist and academic researcher with over a decade of experience in exhibition making and pedagogical interventions. Working at intersection of culture, art, and architecture, her practice investigates materiality through histories, geographies, and everyday practices. Emphasizing situated knowledge that shapes the meaning and function of art, Fatma's curatorial approach blurs the line between exhibition making and classroom interventions, fostering collaboration with practitioners, students, and communities. Her work in both art and academia focuses on critically analyzing geography shaped by prevailing notions of space, influencing how creative practices are represented in post colonial environments. She is the founder of Second Practice, a collective for collaborative artistic research, and co directs Large World, an interdisciplinary collective focused on culture, heritage, and creative space. Fatma exhibited globally at venues including the Karachi Biennale, the 17th Istanbul Biennale, and Icon Gallery London. Her recent writing includes recognizing choice and practices of making 2022 and keeping it alive under their hands 2022, addressing craft, landscapes, and post-colonial geographies. Thank you for being here, Fatma, and we're very excited to hear your insights today. Over to you.
Thank you, Ishal. Thank you, Marvi. Hello, everyone, and thank you for such an interesting lineup. I think we have a lot to muse over and discuss. I'll quickly share my slides. Okay, so I'm by practice a visual artist, but at heart, I'm a researcher. And I've always been interested in understanding how one makes things, how one makes what they make, how things come into being, what drives practice, how does it all come together, how do forms arise. So this has been this has informed my own individual practice as well as the research work that I do with various collectives. So as part of my research at Largeworth, which I co-direct, Largeworth is a collective that works at the intersection of art, architecture, culture, heritage, etc. And so today I will be talking about a particular case that I've been working on as part of Largeworth. And last year, I spent conserving an ancient practice of weaving shu. Shu is a woolen textile, particular to Upper Chitral Valley. And and it is woven. It is particular to a very, very remote village in Upper Chitral Valley. And so shu basically is a woolen textile of about 12 to 16 inches wide. It is a derivative of that is called pattu in Baltistan. But in Chitral, it is woven on a very ancient loom called the sak, as you can see. This loom is believed to have reached the valley via the ancient Silk routes back in between the 5th and the 10th century. So while working on reviving this practice, the case that I'm going to share with you today, we watched a 70-year-old weaver, Dadil Khan, who is my protagonist for this case, approached the restored loom with a lot of hesitation. So we were working there, we spoke to a lot of locals, we interviewed Dadil Khan, we wanted to revive the loom first before we start working on the textile. And for months, he insisted that he had forgotten how to weave the intricate Lasprikan shu. Lasprikan shu is particular to Laspur Valley. And that he claimed that he hadn't woven for 2 decades, and therefore he really doesn't know how to work the sak. He doesn't know how to weave that particular textile anymore. And so once the loom was revived, and I will go into the detail of how we did that, but once that was revived and placed into a somewhat of a familiar setting, something remarkable happened. When his feet engaged the pongodar is a local name for the pedals, and his hands gripped the sak, which is the beater on the revived loom, he immediately started synchronizing the treading and beating motions. And within minutes, the patterns that he claimed had supposedly vanished from his memory flowed from his muscles. And he reproduced the characteristic pattern of Lasprikan shu, which is the reverse twill chevron pattern he called, and also it is locally known as the पैर चलते हैं जैसे चकोर की चाल. So that is how he explained it. So it was a reverse chevron pattern. People who are sort of familiar with textile weaving would understand what that means. And so chakor is basically a bird, mountain partridge, that traces zigzag trails while it walks. So that single moment of reawakening really sums up what our year-long hands-on research had been saying all along. And here's the case. This is the case that I want to make. That when vernacular landscape is wiped away, the mind doesn't merely lose track of the information. What gets cut off is this circuitry that lets memory surface. And by vernacular landscape, I mean the everyday, the locally shaped environment, be it built or natural. And recalling isn't a mental trick. You can't really recall something just like that. The body needs that circuitry to be rebuilt in order for memory to surface. And here's where I want to also sort of quote the theory that I work with, which is pulling down that landscape and replacing it with sort of alien materials or layouts forces people to remake or often suspend practices on someone else's terms. And Stengers calls this ontological violence, the imposition that ruptures the world's condition of existence. What we saw with the loom was that Dadil's memory surfaced only when the familiar loom sat in a familiar place. And so my argument sort of unfolds in 3 linked steps. And these are that memory is suspended, it's never lost. So embodied skills don't just vanish, they lie dormant, waiting for a reactivation of some sort. And you think of seeds lying underground, perfectly viable, but they wait for the right sort of weather and the right season to turn before they start sprouting. So it's exactly like that. So memories never get lost. They just suspended somewhere. And then the second linked step is that architecture is a trigger. So architecture becomes that physical cue that can unlock memory or that can sort of surface memory which is suspended. Because memory isn't locked in mind or the body or the space alone. It lives in the ever-shifting relationship of all of these 3. And the third thing is that to be able for memory to resurface, you have to reknit the entire web. So in order for makers and the place and the body and the mind, for all of them to think together. So walls, beams, textures, spatial acoustics, all hold communal memory and knowledge. And when any element is removed, the entire constellation collapses. And therefore, sort of effective conservation therefore demands revisiting the full web of agents, which includes built form, landscape, body, the tacit knowledge lodged in muscles, practices, sounds, temperatures, and the whole web is required so that practice, place, people may remember together. So while I've been working in Laspur for the last decade, so I've been involved with the community on and off for various things. Prior to conserving this practice of shoe, I worked with makers of qaleen and qaleen, the women who weave qaleen. And that practice too is entirely embedded in their ecological landscape. And while working with these women, we came across, the practice of shoe weaving, which had significantly declined up until last year. There were only around 8 to 9 weavers who remembered how to weave and were not weaving anymore. They could recall the practice and claim that they could perhaps weave. So we had no idea whether they could weave or they couldn't. So our method, so I'm just going to briefly speak about the method. So our method to conserve heritage is largely community-based and community-led. And there's no one framework that fits all. And unlike physical assets, this is like a practice that we're conserving, it was a complex task because it required participatory action research that sort of positions community members not as informants, but more as co-researchers. And so through this, we were able to first research the loom that was used, which was then revived for use as well. So we were opposed to the idea of being didactic with the loom. So, we didn't want to train the community again over something that they already knew. And therefore, we needed the weavers to try the revived loom and test their memory out and weave something which others could watch and learn from. And so this wasn't sort of a salvage ethnography sort of a thing in which, there's a hurried anthropological effort to record practices that are sort of and artifacts that are on the brink of disappearance. Rather, it was more of a what Stengers would call the slow science. So, taking time to understand the full ecology of this practice. So we documented not just the techniques, but also the spatial relationships. So not just objects that accompanied it, but also the myths and the folklores that accompanied it, the value of shoe within the community, how they see it, how they wear it, and what it meant for the community. So we didn't want to really alienate either the process of making or what it becomes later on. So it had to be exactly how they had stored it in their memories. So through our research on the loom, which is locally known as the sak, we found that it was likely brought from China, as I mentioned earlier, via the Silk Route, and between the 5th and the 10th century. So this sak, we traced it in Central Asia as well, and then in China. So this particular sak was originally used for weaving silk. And that meant that that Laspur or the Upper Chitral Valley did have mulberry trees at some point, and the community could recall that, yes, they did have mulberry trees at some point. And the sak probably used to weave silk, was used to weave silk. But then with the decline of the mulberry trees in the Upper Chitral Valley, the loom adapted to wool. So the technology and the practice carried on while its sort of material basis completely shifted. And by 2024, the 8 weavers in Laspur still practice Lasprakan shoe. But the question was that, is this knowledge truly vanishing, or had it entered some sort of a state of suspension? And this is the question that we sort of worked with for the entire year. So our participatory documentation went beyond sort of measuring and recording. We worked with the elder weavers to understand not just the loom structure, but its spatial demands, the height, the height that would guide, and the gestures that and the width that would guide the gestures, and the relationship to light, the earth, and what creates these working rhythms. So the reconstruction became a form of a participatory research as well. As we rebuilt the loom with the weavers and the local carpenters, we relied on what they could recall. So we relied on what they could recall from their own sort of childhood. Almost all of them had seen the working sak in their homes when they were young. Hence, we weren't just creating an object, but reestablishing this sort of a circuit that included the tangible and the intangible. The precise spatial material conditions that allowed the embodied knowledge to flow. And after a few experiments, we arrived at a workable sak, which not only worked, but also seemed familiar to the weavers. So we were careful not to change the shape, the scale, the color of it. We even contemplated what material we would use. So timber, what kind of, so we didn't use poplar, apricot wood was used to, and since the color and the essence of it had to be retained. So we were very careful about, what material goes into it. So what the revived sak taught us is that the tools alone cannot wake up a practice, and that they need a room that sort of once held them as well. And so let's zoom out for a second and see what this sort of space, what the sort of space that the loom lived and worked in. So in Laspur, that room was almost always the vernacular kitchen. So built out of mud brick and with a sunken hearth, the 5 roof pillars. It was more like an ecological switchboard. The central pillar was used as an anchor for the backstrap of the loom. There were fixed sitting spaces for women to spin and weave, guests to be entertained, food to be cooked, grains to be stored, etc. So I'm sorry, I do not have an image for the modern kitchen because I never felt the need to draw it. But with the arrival of the modern cemented kitchens that are hygienic, sort of more modular, pillar-free, and perhaps more efficient, the loom has nowhere to hitch. So now, as the community or as the architecture is moving towards, modern sort of kitchens, this entire environmental circuitry has been severed. So the knowledge is not lost or disappeared. It just sits in suspension somewhere. And so this transformation is what Stengers represents as the ontological violence, which here is the material and the spatial, which in this case is the material and the spatial logic. So it is not the cement that is inherently destructive, but it severs the environmental circuitry that essentially connects architecture, bodies, cultural memory. And our participatory workshops with women who sort of remember the old kitchens revealed how profoundly space shapes practice. And another practice that we found was diminishing because of the lack of vernacular kitchens was the practice of gidoi. So calling gidoi is like calling women spinners to come and spin the yarn. So the women would all gather in one kitchen where they cook, they sing, they dance, tell jokes, while spinning yarn for one piece of shoe. And it is said that women were able to spin yarn for one entire piece of shoe, which is measuring 8 yards, in one night. And in this case study shows that conserving a practice means conserving this spatial matrix. And vernacular architecture, mud walls, timber posts, even the smoke darkened ceilings. What it needs is if you remove one element, this entire mnemonic pathway sort of collapses, and you rebuild the pathway, and the craft remembers itself. And that is why heritage work cannot really stop at sort of cataloging objects or recording techniques. It must rebuild relationships between place, material, muscle, so that making, landscape, and people can all sort of remember together. So let me again return to Dadil Khan's sort of reawakened hands. And his story sort of demonstrates all three dimensions of my argument. So first, his suspended knowledge sort of awaited this ecological reactivation. It had not gone away, but it was just dormant, requiring proper conditions to resurface. Second, the participatory reconstruction proved that the architectural cues are indispensable for reforming mnemonic pathways. And third, it showed that why treating architecture as an isolated asset totally fails, because the loom alone wasn't enough. It needed the full environmental circuitry for the memory to resurface. So our participatory research shows that ecological reactivation is possible when we understand that architecture is not an asset, but more of an environmental, a sort of an agent within this environmental circuit, which sort of holds memory as well, communal memory as well. That's all from me, and I hope I'm on time.
Thank you, Fatma. You were actually just 3 minutes left, so thank you for ending it. Really appreciate it, and what a great way of looking at preservation. I mean, it's incredible how you talk about the ecology and the landscape being embedded as a form of an advocacy. So thank you so much for sharing this, and we'll open up right now for some questions. But before that, I would like to thank all the 4 speakers for putting out a different way of looking at heritage and preservation in this interesting space of metamorphosis. We have some questions in the chat box, but we have some also questions that we formed for you. So let Ishal open up that, and then we will request our audience if they want to, have any observation, discuss with us, the speakers. You're more than welcome to please do that. Ishal.
Yes. So there were some questions in the chat box. The first question for Aniruddh. I have a small question that this approach is hopefully applicable for mostly famous modernistic buildings, but in cases like Karachi, where there are a lot of modern structures, nothing of heritage value and in poor conditions, do you think these frameworks can be acted without building being important in any context?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I think that's the main argument I was also trying to address, that a lot of we tend to wait in conservation and heritage circles for something to have heritage value. But if you break down, heritage value is something which is there in the eyes of the beholder. Whereas, like, that's my argument as well, that a lot of the buildings need not wait for gaining heritage value. And every building has a material value embedded within it. So whether it is a famous building, and again, the famous is also coming from it's a famous designer who's making a building, or the building is being talked about in famous circles. There's nothing inherent famous about infrastructure itself. So be it a bus stop or a high rise, if you boil it down through a material analysis, for from an environmental perspective, they are sort of the same. So that is sort of I think the argument that even if buildings are not from the same heritage status and across geographies and contexts, this methodology can help sort of make an argument for preserving them, because it's very hard to create argument of like, why should you retain a shopping mall, for example? It has inherently no beauty value in the academic circles, neither a communal value or neither a heritage value. But at the time, right now, it's a building which is there, and it is very important for us to make use of it, which is existing.
And that also makes me kind of like reflect, because when Padvati Maidan was demolished across the border, I think my heart was aching in a very different way, because in my undergrad years, I looked at that work and I kind of studied that work for many reasons, and also like its importance of what the structure as for an architect student played that part. But again, coming back to what these days is making me really interested in thinking of heritage from a different way is actually looking at scale preservation. These buildings and structures brought a very interesting scale to the city, and the community kind of was attached to it, gets attached to it. And these are, let's say, neighborhoods. They are also central spaces like roundabouts, structures which are standing on its own. And no one is talking about, still people are still talking about heritage from a perspective of number, or a property number. But here one needs to also think from a cluster perspective, that what do these heritage scale preservation means in today's time. So again, thank you so much. And I mean, your presentation was a great episode of like a reflection to our own fractured cities, how we are looking at heritage.
So the second question addresses both Abuzar and Aniruddh. We often hear about cities like London or Paris being built around rivers, where the river becomes central to both heritage and urban identity. In Pakistan, our river settlements, like those along Ravi, are mostly rural and often neglected in architectural imagination. So my question is, what would a sustainable approach look like to preserve the heritage of Ravi while still allowing for meaningful and impactful architecture to emerge from it without falling into extractive or elitist models of urban development?
आई थिंक माधु, इस सवाल पे मैं एक और सवाल ये भी ऐड करूंगी कि तुम्हारा अपना जो प्रोजेक्ट ऑफ सस्टेन जो तुम अभी कैरी ऑन कर रहे हो, जो रावी बचाओ तहरीक है, इफ यू कैन एक्सपैंड ऑन दैट पार्ट. आई थिंक वो मौका नहीं मिला हमें उस बारे में बात करने की, मगर क्या पता ये तुम इससे एक्सटेंड कर सकते हो.
एक तो शुक्रिया. इसके बारे में तो मैंने भी सीखना है मारवी से कि दोनों साइड पर हम क्या बनाएंगे जो दरिया के लिए अच्छा होगा. लेकिन इस वक्त तक जो बात समझ में आई है वो ये है कि दरिया को तो फिलवक्त उसको उसकी जगह दी जाए बहने की, और उसको आज़ाद किया जाए. वही सबसे ज़्यादा इस वक्त बात ज़रूरी समझ में आती है. एक तो कई तरह से दरिया के बारे में बात करने की ज़रूरत है. एक तो सबसे बड़ा जुल्म जो दरिया पे है वो इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी है. दूसरा जुल्म जो है वो जो जितना भी वेस्ट है जो दरिया में डायरेक्ट गिर रहा है, और वो सैकड़ों हंड्रेड्स ऑफ किलोमीटर्स को जो हमारा नीचे का एक्वाफर है उसको भी ख़राब कर रहा है. सो उसके साथ भी उसको भी देखने की ज़रूरत है. और तीसरी जो ये मेगा प्रोजेक्ट हैं जो रावी की ज़मीन और इर्द गिर्द पर कब्जा कर रहे हैं, उनके बारे में भी सोचने की ज़रूरत है। सो एक तो ये है कि कोई भी बहुत सारे दरिया हैं जो ट्रांस बाउंड्री रिवर हैं, और कभी भी आप किसी दरिया के साथ ये नहीं करते कि दरिया का पूरा पानी ही आप डैम कर लें। जो अपस्ट्रीम है, ये जो दरियाओं के बुनियादी हकूक़ हैं आलमी सतह पर, उनके भी ख़िलाफ़ है बात। सो इस वक्त हम देख रहे हैं कि किस तरह से फ्लडिंग जो है वो हो रही है, हमारे भी जितने भी पहाड़ी सिलसिले हैं वहाँ भी हो रही है। और जहाँ से रावी और हमारे बहुत सारे दरिया जहाँ से बन रहे हैं, वहाँ भी फ्लडिंग हो रही है। तो आपको तो अब ये बात समझने की ज़रूरत है कि हमारे अपने दरियाओं को ओवरऑल इन्वायरमेंट के लिए हमें अब मिल के काम करने की ज़रूरत है। ये तो जो सरहदें हैं, ये इतनी मसनूई सरहदें हैं कि इनकी वजह से मतलब अब तो ये इस तरह की पाकिस्तान और इंडिया के दरमियान और बांग्लादेश के दरमियान मीटिंग्स होनी चाहिए, और चाइना के दरमियान जो जो खास तौर पर हिमालय को शेयर कर रहे हैं, और कि हम सब जुड़े हुए हैं हिमालय के साथ। हमारा हिमालय से लेकर समंदर तक पूरा ये जमीन जो है वो आपस में जुड़ी है, कनेक्टेड है। सो किस तरह से हमने अपने इस हेरिटेज को, अपने इस इन्वायरमेंट को, अपनी इस इकोलॉजी को बचाना है। हम इस तरह से नहीं बचा सकते कि चाहे जितनी मर्जी डैमिंग। आज ये खबर है कि चाइना जो है पुत्रा पे जो है वो डैम बनाना शुरू कर रहा है। सो ये इस लड़ाई से हमें निकलना पड़ेगा, और हमें दरियाओं को उनका हक देना पड़ेगा जो उनका बहने का हक है। दरिया पर पहला हक ना इंडिया का है ना पाकिस्तान का है। दरिया पर पहला हक दरिया का अपना है, उसकी एजेंसी, उसको ये मानना पड़ेगा। ये दरिया के रिवाइवल का एक है कि हम ये बात करें, ये रिक्वेस्ट करें कि इतना पानी दरियाओं में छोड़ा जाए कि दरिया का जीवन बरकरार रहे। 30% पानी कम से कम दरिया में आना चाहिए। दूसरा यह है कि दरिया को साफ करने के जो कुछ नेचर बेस्ड सोल्यूशन हैं वो तलाश किए जाएं। इस तरह के यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में ख़ास तौर पर स्टूडेंट्स को इंगेज किया जाए। जो रावी बचाओ तहरीक की भी यही डिमांड है। सो कि जितने भी ये जो रियल एस्टेट के, और ख़ास तौर पर जो नए ये लफ्ज़ हैं, सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट, जो मारवी के साथ और भी दोस्तों के साथ बात होती है कि किस तरह से ये हमें वर्ल्ड बैंक ही दे रहा है और वहीं से आ रहे हैं। सो कि और फिर इन्हीं के थ्रू अब जो ग्रीन कॉलोनाइजेशन है या नई तरह की कॉलोनाइजेशन है, ज़मीन की भी, लोगों की भी, कम्युनिटीज़ की भी, वो हो रही है। तो उसके बारे में जो है वो देखा जाए कि हमारे यहाँ से हम मिल के सोच के किस तरह के सोल्यूशन बना सकते हैं जो नेचर बेस्ड सोल्यूशन हो, जो ध- जो अ, जो जो इस कंस्ट्रक्शन और मेगा प्रोजेक्ट्स के बगैर हों, जिसमें हमें बहुत ज़्यादा एड जो है वो लेनी पड़े, और दोबारा वो कर्ज का एक सिलसिला जो है वो शुरू हो। और तीसरा जो है, मुझे लगता है कि हमें अब तो डेवलपमेंट के बजाय डी डेवलप करने की ज़रूरत है। दरियाओं के इर्द गिर्द भी और बड़े शहरों के साथ जो कुछ हो रहा है इस वक्त, जो गेटेड सोसाइटीज़ और वो सब बन रहा है। लाहौर के इस वक्त 3 अतराफ में हाउसिंग सोसाइटीज़ हैं, जो मास्टर प्लान में जो एक हिस्सा था कि जहाँ से शहर को हवा मिलनी थी, सब्जी आनी थी, खुराक आनी थी। सो अब वो सब बर्बाद हो चुका है, और अब सिर्फ एक तरफ से जो ये रावी का हिस्सा था, यहाँ से शहर को थोड़ी सी, यहाँ पे ग्रीनरी थी और एग्रीकल्चर लैंड था। तो हम इसको इस तरह से प्रिजर्व कर सकते हैं या अपनी हेरिटेज को बचा सकते हैं कि हम साथ में कोई इस तरह के जंगल बनाएं जो हमारे शहर को हवा दें, जहाँ से हमारा जो ओवरऑल हमारी कार्बन इमिशन और जो जो कुछ भी हम शहर का जो निज़ाम है, और जिस तरह से हम दुनिया की जहरीली हवा में सांस ले रहे हैं, हमें तो रावी के पूरे हिस्से को जो है वो डिक्लेयर कर देना चाहिए कि यहाँ पर जो है वो जो गांव आबाद हैं वो वहाँ पर आबाद रहें, जो झुग्गियाँ आबाद हैं वो आबाद रहें। अब सिर्फ एक छोटी सी लास्ट बात करूंगा, क्योंकि टाइम मैं ज़्यादा ले रहा हूँ मुझे लग रहा है, कि अब वहाँ पर एक झुग्गी, एक बस्ती थी, झुगियां सन, जो टेंट बस्ती होती है, जो पिछले 40 साल से रावी की जमीन पर बैठे थे। हमारी प्राइम मिनिस्टर आती है ब्रिज का इफ्तिताह करने, और वहां से उसकी नजर पड़ जाती है उन झुग्गियों पर, और वो कहती है कि इसको फौरन, इन झुग्गियों को यहाँ से डिस्प्लेस किया जाए, ये गंद फैला रहे हैं रावी पे। सो अब क्या किया कि जिनका कार्बन इमिशन ना होने के बराबर है, उन झुग्गियों को रातों रात, एक दिन की भी उनको जो है मोहलत नहीं दी गई, क्योंकि उनके पास ना आवाज है, ना ना वो शहर से उस तरह से जुड़े हुए हैं। उनको बिल्डोजर्स के साथ जो है वो खत्म किया गया। और वो जो हजारों लोगों की बस्ती थी, जहाँ जो 30-40 साल से वहां पे रह रहे थे, वहां पे उन्होंने प्लांटेशन की कि हमने दरख्त लगाए हैं। अब एक तरफ आप ये कर रहे हैं और दूसरी साइड पर आप 1,10,000 एकड़ को कंक्रीट में कन्वर्ट कर रहे हैं। सो आपका क्या है कि जो जो ऑलरेडी जो वहां पर लोग मौजूद है जिनका रिश्ता भी दरिया के साथ है, आप उनको उठा रहे हैं, डिस्प्लेस कर रहे हैं और उसकी जगह पर गेटेड सोसाइटी नहीं बना रहे हैं। तो जो रावी बचाओ तहरीक है, ये कुछ साल पहले शुरू की और ये इन 3 बातों के खिलाफ ही खड़ी है। नंबर 1, कि जितना भी ये नए न्यू लिबरल डेवलपमेंटल प्रोजेक्ट्स हैं, इनको बंद किया जाए, रावी को जीने का हक दिया जाए, वहां पे किसानों को हक दिया जाए, और जो मल्लाह हैं उनका पहला हक है रावी पर, वो उनसे जो भी आपका प्लान है उनसे पूछा जाए। दूसरी जो हमारी डिमांड है वो जो सीवरेज और जो जितना भी वेस्ट दरिया में गिर रहा है उसके बारे में है कि ये इस तरह के प्रोजेक्ट्स के बजाय कोई नेचर बेस्ड सोल्यूशन कोई तलाश किए जाएं, यूनिवर्सिटीज़ का, स्टूडेंट्स का कोई इस तरह के वो रिसर्च प्रोजेक्ट उन्हें दिए जाएं और हम देखें कि हम कैसे इसको कर सकते हैं। और ख़ास तौर पर इंडस्ट्रियल एरिया, हमारे पास लॉ मौजूद है, सिर्फ हमें जो उसको इन्फोर्स करवाना है लॉ को, उसके लिए किस तरह से किसान, मजदूरों, स्टूडेंट्स, तालिब इल्मों और औरतों और इन सब की जो मूवमेंट है वो इकट्ठी होने की ज़रूरत है, और ये प्रेशर बनाने की ज़रूरत है कि जो इंडस्ट्रियल एरियाज अपना जहर रावी में गिरा रहे हैं वो उस पर पाबंदी लगाएं। और तीसरा, जो इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी में एक हडियारा ड्रेन जो इंडिया से सारा सीवरेज लेके आती है और वहां से भी वहां की इंडस्ट्री का सीवरेज भी आके दरिया में गिरता है और ये इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी में शामिल है। सो इस पर भी पाबंदी आयद की जाए। जो आलमी कवानीन हैं दरिया के, ज़मीन के और इनके हकूक़ हैं, उन पे काम किया जाए। सो यही हम उसके लिए वीकली प्रोटेस्ट करते हैं, मंथली बैठक करते हैं, स्टडी सर्कल करते हैं, और एक एनुअल हमारी फरवरी में रावी यात्रा होती है जिसमें हम शहर से दरिया तक पैदल जाते हैं कि इस ताल्लुक को शहर की मेमोरी में वापस लाया जाए। क्योंकि दरिया की एक तो यह है कि इसमें कोशिश है कि जो नुमाइंदगी है वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता जो दरिया और दरिया की कम्युनिटी है उनके पास जाए।
ये जो अबूजर बात कर रहे थे उसी पे मैं बोलना चाहता उस क्वेश्चन में ही एक इम्प्लाइड ये ऑफन होता है कि लंदन और पेरिस में नदी के अराउंड डेवलपमेंट होता है, पर आई थिंक एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज़ है कि उनकी नदियाँ आर
हमारे
डिफरेंट,
यस
जैसे जो हम रावी की बात कर रहे हैं,
यस
क्योंकि वो मैन मेड कनाल्स हैं। सो उससे क्या होता है कि उनका शेप कभी नहीं बदलता, सो यू कैन डेवलप राइट टिल द वाटर एज। और ये एक इमेजिनेशन और एस्पिरेशन फिर बन जाता है कि मुझे डेवलपमेंट बनना है, और वाटर फ्रंट डेवलपमेंट विच यू सी एवरीवेयर इन रिवर्स लाइक रावी और यमुना भी, बिकॉज वो रेन फेड है, उनका जो नेचर एंड साइज है वो बदलता रहता है, एंड therefore you need to leave that gap. So by imagination only you can't have a waterfront development. और जैसे अबूजर बोल रहे थे, ऐसा इमेजिनेशन में होता है कि ये ज़मीन खाली है, बिकॉज ऐसा लगता है कि ये सिर्फ फार्म लैंड है जिनमें फ्लडिंग होती है, लेकिन यहाँ पर बहुत सारी कम्युनिटीज़ ऑलरेडी हैं। एंड जो आप बात कर रहे थे कि सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट की सबसे ज़्यादा दिक्कत और इन्वायरमेंटली इम्पैक्टफुल इज मेकिंग द फाउंडेशंस एंड डिगिंग इट. So if you really want to develop, one is don't develop right till the waterfront, leave the buffer. And if you do want to develop, because that's necessary in Lahore and Karachi and Delhi, you develop on the same footprint so that you can build on top of what already exists and not displace, like you were saying.
Thank you so much, Aniruddh. That really made
बहुत
sense. And also,
yeah
to add on that these are peri lands as well, and they need to be left alone for breathing. ये जो सांस लेना है शहर में, ये सिर्फ एक human relationship नहीं है, ये ecological relationship भी है, where you have to let the city breathe, repair, and maintain itself through these spaces of silence and gaps. So on that basis, we have 2 more questions, and then we'll open up and we'll see if there is anybody who wants to, because we're already running a little late. So Ishal, can you jump into those?
Yes.
We have 2 questions for Ali, which we will merge together, and then we have a question for Fatma. So let's shoot that.
So there's a question from our team to Fatma. In your writing on craft and landscape, you emphasize material memory. How could we collect and show everyday craft like traditional woodworking or textile making to help people remember and value their community spaces when rapid development is changing their neighborhood?
Okay, so it's a difficult question, as I mentioned earlier. Mapping or conserving practices isn't an easy job, but I think The case that I was trying to make was that practice isn't only about tools and materials. And I mean, and that really also I can extend that conversation also to, art schools and studio spaces where we believe that, art can just happen within a studio space once you hand a sort of list of materials to students. I think making is far more inherent. And I think making and a lot more goes into making, and which extends beyond materials and tools and even landscapes. So there are non-human sort of beings that are that come into play while making happens. So, and especially if you look at making within sort of indigenous communities, if you go and you ask someone what do they make, they will never be able to articulate what they make. You can never get a straight answer. It is only through these combination of things coming together is when these making sort of practices of making surface. And I have seen this extensively over the past decades with my work on practices of making, that there is no sort of articulation of what they make and then how they make it. So that's another very large question you can never they can never answer, because where is the material coming from is also sort of so embedded within their ecological landscape, that they will probably never be able to tell you something as simple as you go and buy that material. It isn't as simple as that. So therefore, when working with communities or conserving practices, I think slow science works. There are no sort of quick solutions to this. So you need to live and understand what that what knowledge the community or that landscape holds, and then it will start to reveal itself. And I would say that even, while conserving the practice of shoe, I don't think we did justice entirely because, things still keep revealing themselves. But we tried to keep the only marker was that whatever conservation work we're doing doesn't alienate the community. So, even if it's the loom that is made, it doesn't alienate them. They shouldn't need trainings on that loom, which is more of, the developmental way to work with communities. You go and train people. No, they don't need training. They know it already. I think all conservation can do is facilitate, in that, gelling up of all these sort of factors.
Thank you. So the next question is to Ali. To what extent does the economic dependency of Bahria Town residents on the village populations, particularly for service such as low-wage labor, contribute to the continued existence of these villages, preventing them from being entirely absorbed or overtaken by Bahria Town? And the second question is how far are these villages from the main residential units of Bahria Town? Do residents pass by them on daily commute, or are the villagers lives a very out of sight, out of mind situation for them?
Thank you so much for these questions. I'm just gonna quickly answer them. By saying, first of all, Bahria Town largely is a speculative investment real estate land. So there's not a lot of residents who live there. A lot of the land, apartments, houses in Bahria Town are investment properties, either as investment for overseas Pakistanis or people who think that they will retire and live there in whatever condition that it will exist then. But it is mostly empty. So not a lot of people live there. However, yes, the edges of the boundary wall of the village is right next to the roads and the housing units that are being built. So they're in very close proximity and you can see them. In fact, the big hotels that they're building and the big golf courses that they're building, they're right opposite to these villages. And these villages are also concentrated in clusters across the entire compound. And about the economic dependency, when I first went in, I also thought that maybe Bahria Town is using people from these villages as labor force for construction purposes, because there's a lot of construction work that's kind of continuously happening. But that story is also very kind of not entirely one way. Mostly the answer is no. Bahria Town does not use the labor from these villages for construction, or kind of employ them in any kind of labor work, because there is racial and ethnic prejudice and quality to the eviction and displacement of these villages as well. You see, Bahria Town's inception was kind of predicated and curtained by the war on terror. And that story is very important, that I did not mention, but instances of red zoning in Karachi, the Karachi operation, of counterterrorism, all of those stories are very, very important in the making of Bahria Town. And a lot of these counter-terrorist movements and efforts, like the Karachi operation, were shadowed by kind of an ethnic racial prejudice against the Baloch, Sindhi, and Afghan refugees, for instance. Um, and because most of these villages are populated by Baloch people, from the interviews, from the conversations that I've had with them, from their own words, it is a very clear kind of an anti-Baloch situation, as an anti-Baloch landscape as well. From the laborers that I spoke to there, they spoke about how tens of thousands of laborers are kind of imported, are brought in from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab. Um, so there is a kind of disconnect here, where local labor force is not being used, and there is an active kind of concentration of these villages, to not allow them any kind of economic independence, in any way, shape, or form. Um, and of course, there is the question of also how these villages kind of continue to economically sustain themselves, which they have. It's an everyday kind of struggle, everyday negotiation against Bahria Town and its forces. So they use these small cabins. They use informal ways of getting out of Bahria Town, doing something, bringing back some stuff, some money, or they run their smaller economies within the village. Um, but their connection to Bahria Town and its kind of employment structure is very much limited.
Thank you so much, Ali. We would now like to open up for our audience. If you have any observation, any quick response to our session 3, we would love to hear from you. If not, then we will close in 2 minutes. Samil usually has a last note if you want to jump in.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marvi, and thank you to all our speakers. This had been a very informative session in figuring out the forms and scales on which heritage and conservation can work. And thank you so much for being a part of this webinar, and also to our lovely audience who engaged so much with our speakers. And if you want to if you have any questions, etc., please reach out to us and we will be able to answer them in more details. Thank you so much for joining.
I have to also end on this one note for all of you to know this, that these videos, when they get uploaded online, I know a lot of teachers and academics share our work in classrooms where students access these and use this as a referencing whenever they write. So these webinars are very successful when it comes to more expansion knowledge. So again, all your work is going to be useful in classes. So thank you again, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was incredible.
Mirbani, Saryandi.
Thank you.